It is with regret that this newspaper reports that Vladilena Milise passed away at 0532 this morning. This paper has reached out to her husband, Shinai Nozin, but he is yet to make comment. Vladilena Milise was instrumental to the defeat of the Legion threat, and her death puts a sour twist on the celebrations of the end of the war. Good evening. Or should I say good morning? Dustin glanced at the clock, then winced. What makes you stay up so late? I can always make time to see my lovely husband. There's a reason I married him. You make me sound like an exhibit in the zoo. Anju stood from her stool. Maybe you are. Maybe we are. They laughed. It was the last time Anju laughed. Last moments stick with people in strange ways. Dustin always remembered this one for Anju laughing, with the half-light of the kitchen playing with her face. 2 of the light bulbs had blown and not been replaced, and her good nature shining over everything. Although they went to bed together, they didn't wake up together. Anju was found cold with her head in the oven. Dustin cried, and dialed the police. Later that day he found himself in Ernst's office. Ernst's face had collapsed on itself. He looked like a man who had just had the world kicked out from under him. Suicide pact. The damned fools. Dustin nodded. The Spearhead 5 was dead by their own hands. Poison, asphyxiation, gunshot. Whatever a decade of war had failed to do was done in peace in 5 minutes. He felt like crying, but could not. Ernst placed a bottle of whiskey on his desk and rummaged for some glasses. A drink? Aye. Ernst poured some into Dustin's glass and then some into his own. He tipped it onto the carpet before refilling the glass, which he raised in a toast. To a better place, may they be there. A penny. A penny passage. I didn't come here because I was dead. Pull the other one. A penny passage or you cannot cross. I know the rules. I also know that those aren't the only rules in this place. You want to play that game? The mugger laughed and twisted the knife he had in the boatman's gut. It's a game I've always played. You cannot kill the man who is already dead. True, but what about them? I'm not going to look. That's the oldest trick in the book. A penny passage. Have as many pennies as you need. There was a thud, and a sackful of old copper pennies spilled out across the deck of the punt. You came? Anju smiled cruelly. We always follow you, Undertaker. Come high water or hell. The boatman laughed and grabbed his quant. It seems a little cruel to bury them like this, said Dustin. He stood on the lawn of the presidential palace, which was currently having a massive hole dug in it. Excavators were moaning, workmen were shouting, and above all, the flag of the Confederacy flew at half-mast. Ernst shook his head. I decided to respect their requests a long time ago. I've regretted that decision ever since, and I regret it now, but my word is my bond. Dustin nodded. You know, she called it an aluminium coffin in her sleep. I never thought she'd want to be buried in it, or on a bed of ordnance. Only princesses care about sleeping on beds of peas. She was a god of war, and as a war god shall she be buried. Dustin shook his head. You could have been a poet. In another life, I would have been. Shin breathed in and out and stared at the giant cliff of black stone that ascended as high as the eye could see. On Earth, the tops of the cliff would have been shrouded in clouds. Curtains of electrical discharge danced there. It looked like electrical discharge at least. This was the underworld, not Earth. Already it felt like they belonged there, as if the cold stone walls were paradise. In a way they were, because they were fading into nothingness. What had started as a burning desire to see Lena again had faded. It was still there, but it wasn't the entirety of his being. Those stone cliffs were black because they stole the tiredness out of souls. They were stealing the disappointment of broken dreams. They bore the burdens that shattered the backs of better men. It was the valley of the peace of death. In the bottoms, old trees raised branches to the sky and swayed softly, moaning, "Rest here, rest please." Spearhead couldn't rest because they were preparing juggernauts that hissed, "War, oh burn, oh." Others glanced their way before carrying on their journey. Old bent men laid down their sticks to walk on new strong limbs. Guide helped limp wounded soldiers. Anju had asked after Dyer. The guide had detachedly observed Anju's oil-stained hands. Go on, he said. Anju put a bit of steel into her voice, and it felt out of place in the calm of the valley. Where to? Where you can't follow and stay human. Anju smiled, her familiar, cruel smile. Spearhead hasn't been human in a long time. That is what we are here to fix. We? The guide hesitated. Maybe not yet, but eventually. Anju laughed. Then the juggernaut spluttered into action. There was a bang and a hiss, and Shin fired his grapnel and began to climb the cliff face. Anju vaulted into her juggernaut and followed. The black cliff crumbled apologetically under the steel of the legs. They didn't have power raids, but they knew where Shin was going and what he wanted, how his burdens, his pains, his wants would never be absorbed by the Valley of Death, because Shin had already died one time too many. Inside the cockpit, electrical discharge sparked between her hands as they flew from control to control, managing grapnel and motion. Where their guide, their undertaker, went, they would follow, until the end, wherever that was. In the distance, rising above the cliffs, was a palace. It had walls of black crystal stone, rough and edged and unforgiving, but from ramparts flew banners full of colour that looked inviting. Maybe, if she wasn't following Undertaker, Anju would have stopped peaceably. But no, she was at war. But for the first time in her life, war felt strange and unnatural, as if war wasn't even necessary in this realm. Spearhead advanced across over a drawbridge. Hail, Undertaker! A tall man with white eyes that had no pupils riding a pale horse shouted from the courtyard. A threadbare cloak covered his wasted and bony body. I have been waiting for you. Many things have waited for me. They waited for death, Shinai of the Nosen. You are not death, I am death. Nobody has waited for you in a long time. Lena. Death lifted his face to the sky. Even though there were no pupils, it looked like he was looking for stars that didn't exist. She hasn't waited for anyone in a very long time. Death dismounted. His field boots met the cobblestones, and Undertaker fired. Death was still standing. Give me my wife back, said Shin. His voice was hoarse with rage. You're the Undertaker, not Orpheus. Death made a fist, and Shin's juggernaut crumpled. Metal screamed as it was tortured at the mercy of the shadow of war. Did you think you could threaten me? Did you think you could make me? The hatch opened. Shin climbed out, bleeding. No. But I knew I could try. Come out. Death glared at the rest of Spearhead, then snapped his fingers. Some leather couches and a coffee table appeared. He sat down. Did anyone ever tell you that you did enough? Yes. Did you ever believe it? No. Kurena and Raiden arrived and stood behind Shin. Theo and Andrew stood side by side. The castle walls were fading, blowing away like fog being driven before the sun. Then you need to hear some things. You were all dealt an incredibly difficult hand. You did well. Shin, you took upon yourself responsibility and accountability over things you never had any control of. That you failed is not a fault. Raiden, you can drown as well in a bathtub as 100 miles from land. Andrew, you are loyal. You have acquitted yourself with dignity and honor. Kurena, your time will come. It takes more courage to dream than anyone cares to admit. Striving to achieve them, even ordinary dreams, is not wrong. Theo, it's going to be alright. Death paused and looked at the sky made of strange dark energies. Do you believe me now? Shin sighed. No. But I came here with a purpose. Where is Lena? Gone. Soon you will be too. This is a place of rest, a final rest where souls make peace and rest. And Lena? Is peace what she made in 5 minutes? Death gave Shin a sad look. She made peace a long time ago. Drink the coffee and you will be returned, or rest. Dustin cried alone. Andrew's clothes were still in the dresser. There was an ice cream container of chicken broth in the freezer that he had made, and she had berated for putting an unhealthy level of salt in it. The oven was still in the apartment. In the old days, the instrument of death would be destroyed. There was a liquor cabinet and one of the small fridges for keeping wine. Dustin couldn't care for either. He couldn't care to move his limbs from the foyer floor to their room. His strength had deserted him. They had left him and he was alone. There was nothing for him here but himself. He didn't like himself. He didn't hate himself. There was simply an empty home and the ghost of a future he had touched and lost, like the sun lost over the horizon or the stars stolen by the nighttime clouds. Dustin was on fire. His soul was burning, and nothing he knew would grow in ash. He only knew that the world was wide.